The youngest captain in the United States Navy was sure he had just sent his first submarine to the bottom. Lieutenant Charles Hutchins' destroyer had run down a U-boat in the open mid-Atlantic, driven her under with star shells, and worked her over with 3 runs of depth charges until a wide slick of fuel oil came up across the surface. To Hutchins, that settled it. He keyed his report to the carrier card, quote, "Scratch 1 pig boat," and searching for more. He was wrong on the first count. The boat was damaged, not finished, and she would run all the way home to her pen at Brest under her own power. The second half of his signal was the true part. These seas were not empty. He was hungry for a real win. There was just one major problem: his own ship. USS Borie was one of the oldest hulls in the Navy, a flush-deck destroyer left over from World War I. By the autumn of 1943, she was 24 years old, as were her 314 feet of thin plating and 4 4-inch guns. Everything that made her dangerous now had been bolted on long after she was built. Surface search radar, 6 20mm guns, a 24-inch searchlight on the platform above the bridge. Despite her age, she was out here because the Allies had changed how they fought the U-boats. For most of the war, they had tied their escorts to the convoys and waited for the submarines to come to them. Now they sent hunters out, a small carrier and a few old destroyers, steered onto the enemy by shore stations, that fixed the wolf packs from their own radio traffic. Less than an hour after the false sink, the radar found him another one. The captain of U-405 had been fighting this war since before Hutchins ever saw a submarine. On board her was Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, a man who knew his boat inside and out. He'd taken her through 7 war patrols, and he was about to spend the next hour proving it. U-405 made the one move that gave Hutchins his opening. She dove. A submerged boat is blind to a destroyer overhead, and Borie still held her on sonar, so Hutchins went after the only thing that would bring her back up into his guns. He drove the destroyer straight over the top of her and let the depth charges go, trying to crack her open or force her up. Depth charges are meant to drop a few at a time, but Borie's came off wrong, causing every charge at her stern to fall into the sea at once and go off together. One blast so big it threw the destroyer's own tail clean out of the water. The same explosion caught U-405 underneath and forced her up, nose first, with her dive gear wrecked, and now she could not get back down. That was the worst thing that could have happened to Hauptmann. A U-boat's whole life is in the deep. Pinned on the surface, lit up, gun to gun with a destroyer, he was being made to fight the one fight his boat was never built for. The sea was running hard, 15-foot waves under a heavy wind, and it pitched both ships as they sat there, the old destroyer and the boat she had pinned on the surface. Hutchins swung the 24-inch searchlight onto her. The beam found U-405 broadside, 400 yards off, riding low and streaming water. An 88mm gun forward, a cluster of 20mm barrels around the conning tower, a white polar bear painted on its face. Every one of those guns was pointing back at Borie. One clean salvo put the submarine's biggest gun in the water. At 400 yards, Borie opened up with everything that would bear. The 4-inch mounts and the 20mm guns coming on almost together, the searchlight holding U-405 dead center while the shells walked into her hull. It went both ways. The submarine's 20s fired back and put a string of rounds into Borie forward, the first real damage of the night. On the foredeck, the crew of the 88mm gun was already swinging the long barrel toward Borie's waterline, lining up the one shot that could open a destroyer end to end. They never got it off. Borie's 20s swept the deck, and every German who came up the hatch and ran for the 88 was lit by the searchlight and cut down before he reached it. Then 3 4-inch guns fired together and blew the gun off the deck and into the sea. The deck was swept clean, and then something happened that Hutchins had not ordered and could not stop. A man climbed onto the conning tower and stood up in the light. He waved his arms over his head, back and forth, the plainest signal there is, asking the ship 400 yards away to stop shooting. Hutchins saw it and called down to cease fire. The guns came off one after another as the order reached them. One did not. The captain of a 4-inch gun behind the bridge had pulled his headphones off in the noise and never heard the word. His gun fired one more time, and the shell reached the conning tower and took the waving man's head from his shoulders. He dropped out of the light. Marr, watching from the platform above the bridge, would carry that one for months. The fire opened back up, and below the dead man, Hoffman put his rudder over and ran for his life. He could not run far. U-405 could still make way on the surface, but her wrecked bow kept her from diving, and that left her fighting on top of the water against a ship with heavier guns, the one thing a submarine is never meant to do. Hoffman fought her there anyway. He kept the boat turning inside Borie's arcs, using the heavy sea to spoil the aim, and held the 2 ships circling while Borie hammered at him and could not finish it. So Hutchins decided to stop shooting and start ramming. He would not outshoot a boat that handled like that in this sea. He would run her down and put his bow through her. The order went out to stand by to ram. Borie heeled over onto the submarine's starboard quarter, building to 25 knots, lining the bow of a 24-year-old destroyer up on the hull of U-405. Reacting quickly, Hoffman saw it coming and threw his rudder hard over to slide out from under it. So Hutchins stopped trying to shoot her and adopted a different strategy. A ram is the oldest move in naval warfare, and Hutchins had just bet his ship on it. Borie came on at 25 knots with her bow lined up on U-405's hull. Hoffman saw it coming and threw his rudder hard to port, slewing the submarine sideways, trying to clear the spot before the bow arrived. He almost made it. Borie was coming down on the water he had just left when the sea took the choice away from both of them. A wave lifted Borie's bow. It rose, climbed, and instead of punching through the submarine's side, it came down on top of her, onto the foredeck just ahead of the conning tower. The hull slammed down and stuck. Then the 2 ships swung together. The sea worked them around until they lay almost side by side, locked in a V. U-405 pinned along Borie's port side and riding low, her deck a few feet beneath the destroyer's rail. Borie was sitting on top of her own enemy, looking down at her, and everything that made her the stronger ship stopped mattering in the same instant. Borie wanted to use her guns and could not. Her 4 and 3-inch mounts could not point down far enough to reach a submarine lying directly under her, and the crews that tried sent shells flat over the top of U-405 and into the empty sea beyond. The guns that had blown the 88 into the water a few minutes earlier were now aimed over the boat they needed to hit. U-405 had the opposite problem, which was no problem at all. Her gun mounts sat lower, and her men could fire level straight across the few feet of water into Borie's hull. The bigger ship could not shoot downward. The smaller one could shoot across. For as long as the 2 stayed locked, the old destroyer was the one with nothing to answer for. And under all of it, the sea kept working, lifting and dropping both hulls, grinding Borie's thin plating against the heavier boat beneath her with every swell. On Borie's deck, everyone knew what to do. 4 days earlier, they had drilled for exactly this. The 2 ships were locked together now, close enough to throw a punch. On October 22nd, the executive officer, Lieutenant Philip Brown, had walked the crew through a problem he made up. A U-boat rammed tight against the port side, too close for the main guns. What do? The men had grumbled through it, the way men grumble through any drill. The thing Brown had imagined was lying a few feet off the port rail, and the crew hit it without waiting for an order, every man moving to the place the drill had put him. Men came up from below with Tommy guns and rifles and pistols, with shotguns kept for riot control, with anything that would fire. They crowded the port rail and shot straight down into the boat a few feet under them. Brass shell casings rained onto the casing below. The 20s hammered alongside the rifle fire, and the noise came back, off U-405's hull and the water, and the men's own gun blasts, until they were shouting to be heard a foot apart. Brown and a signalman stood up on the open bridge and emptied pistols into the deck below. One sailor had nothing but a flare gun, and he leveled it and fired, and the flare hit a German sailor square in the chest and lit him up, burning. The searchlight never left the boat. That 24-inch beam held U-405 lit the whole time, and her deck had nowhere to hide on it. Every German who threw open a hatch and lunged for a gun ran straight into the light, white and exposed, and went down in the rifle fire before he reached it. The ones who got a hand on a mount were shot off it. 2 were close enough to be taken down by hand. Fireman First Class David Southwick threw his sheath knife at a German less than 10 yards off and dropped him with it. Chief Boatswain's mate Walter Cruz grabbed a spent 4-inch shell casing, swung it, and knocked another man clean off the deck into the sea. The whole time, underneath the fighting, the sea was working the 2 hulls together. Borie's plating had been worn thin by 23 years at sea. U-405 was thicker, built heavy to take the pressure of a deep dive. Every swell lifted both ships and dropped them against each other, and it was the old destroyer that gave. Her seams opened along the port side. Water came into the forward engine room and rose around the men holding it, past their knees, past their waists, while they kept the engines turning in the cold and the flood. Up top, the crew was winning. Down below, the ship was losing. For about 10 minutes, the 2 stayed locked that way, the men on Borie's deck cutting the submarine's crew down one at a time, while the submarine's hull quietly opened the destroyer beneath them. Then the sea that had thrown them together pulled them apart momentarily, and with sea room beneath them again, both ships reached for torpedoes. Huffman could no longer win, but he could still make Borie pay for it. Borie fired 1 torpedo, only for it to run off into the swell and miss. U-405 fired back and missed her too. In seas like this, with both ships pitching and rolling hard in the waves, the torpedoes were almost a formality. But now, about 35 of the submarine's 49 men were dead or gone over the side, cut down on the deck, or shot off the mounts during the 10 minutes the ships were locked. Hoffman was fighting his boat with what was left. He was fighting it well. Borie was slowing now, her forward engine room flooded, running on that starboard engine alone. And her turning circle had always been wide. U-405 turned far tighter than she could. Every time Borie hauled around to bring her full battery to bear, the submarine pivoted inside the turn and slipped the arc, and the destroyer's broadside swung through empty water. Hoffman even cranked his stern tube around toward Borie, the 1 torpedo tube facing aft, and kept it trained on her through every turn. Hutchins watched the submarine slide out from under his guns one more time and shut off the searchlight. The light snapped off, and the sea went black around U-405. Hutchins was betting that Hoffman, suddenly unlit and certain he was unseen, would stop dancing and run for open water in a straight line. Borie still had radar. She could hold the boat on the screen with no light at all and wait. It worked. The submarine steadied and ran. Borie came up to 27 knots, tracked her by radar through the run, and threw the light back on. U-405 sat caught in the open, holding a dead straight course, exactly at the target Hutchins had wanted all night. The 4-inch guns fired, and a depth charge battery went over the side together. 3 charges set shallow straddled the conning tower and slammed the boat's momentum to nothing, and a 4-inch salvo found her, and U-405 glided to a halt in the water. She was finished, and her crew knew it. About 14 men climbed out and dropped into yellow rubber rafts, several of them wounded, lifted out on stretchers by the men still standing. The last man off the boat wore an officer's cap. At 2:57 a.m., U-405 went down by the stern, and as she slid under, she blew apart beneath the surface, the scuttling charges going off inside her hull as the sea closed over her. On Borie, the yell went up. Hutchins said later it probably could have been heard in Berlin. Men grabbed each other, pounding each other's backs. An old ship that had hunted submarines for a year and finally stood over the wreck of one. They'd wanted this the whole war, and now they had it. They were still cheering when the men in the rafts started firing flares up into the sky. The men Borie had just sunk were about to get her into far worse trouble than they had managed in the fight. The flares kept coming up out of the rafts, white and red and green, and Borie read them in the way any ship would. Men in the water, calling for help. Hutchins brought the destroyer in toward them. She came around and closed on the rafts off her port bow, slowing, working through the swell, until the faces of the Germans in the water were close enough to make out, 50 or 60 yards off the bow. The same men Borie had been cutting down 20 minutes before were about to be pulled aboard. Then a flare answered from out in the open water. It came up over the horizon, the same colors, fired back at the rafts from a distance. The men in those rafts had not been calling for help. They'd been signaling a second U-boat, surfaced somewhere in the night, and it had just answered that it was coming. A moment later, Borie's sound operator called a torpedo in the water, running on the same bearing as the flare, straight at the ship. Hutchins had no time and no good way out. Borie was slow, fluttered forward, and in no shape to fight a fresh boat. He hauled her hard over and put on everything she had, and the torpedo ran down her port side and past her, close enough that men along the rail watched the wake slide by. The turn took her straight across the rafts. There was no avoiding it. The second boat was out there with more torpedoes. Borie had to be somewhere else fast, and the rafts of U-405 lay directly in the only path she had. She went through them. The men who had climbed out of the sinking submarine, the wounded carried out on stretchers, the officer in his cap, went under Borie's hull as she clawed away to the northwest. Not one of the 49 men from U-405 was ever taken out of the water. Not by Borie, not by the boat that had come for them. The flares stopped. The report of the sinking had already gone out to Card, jubilant, sent in the minutes after the submarine went down and before anyone understood the shape Borie was in. It was the last clear thing the carrier heard from her. The radio went down, and Borie ran northwest in the heavy sea toward a rendezvous she could no longer make. When the light came up, the crew got their first real look at what the night had cost them. For the next 12 hours, the crew fought a second battle against their own ship. Borie had won the fight, and the fight had wrecked her. The whole port side was opened up, bow to stern, where her hull had ground against U-405 through the night. The forward engine room was flooded out completely, the aft one half full, with one engine still turning in the water. The generators were drowned, the power was gone, and below decks, the work went on by hand lanterns. Most of the fresh water for the boilers was lost, so Hutchins fed them seawater, which choked the steam and dragged her down to 10 knots. The ship that had stood over a sinking submarine a few hours earlier could barely move. The radio had no power, and the pumps had run out of gasoline. so the radio men went looking for anything that would burn. They got the auxiliary generator coughing to life on a mix of Zippo lighter fluid and alcohol drained out of a torpedo. And for the first time since the fighting stopped, the carrier heard from Borie again. 2 words: commenced sinking. A beacon went up, and somewhere out in the fog, a plane off card finally found her, 14 miles out. By then, the crew was fighting the sea with buckets. They formed bailing lines and threw the ship overboard piece by piece to keep her head up. The torpedo tubes went over. The 20s went over. More than 100 mattresses, tons of tools and gear. The 1-ton gun director lifted off its mount and dropped into the sea. They kept 10 rounds per gun and pitched the rest. And they threw over the small arms, the rifles, Tommy guns, and shotguns that had won the fight a few hours before, going over the rail now to buy the ship 1 more hour. It was not enough. She kept settling. The storm front was coming. The nearest port was Horta in the Azores, nearly 700 miles off. Everything else 900, and Borie sat close to the center of 5 reported U-boat packs, unable to run. Goff and Barry reached her and could do nothing. The sea was too high to come alongside, too high to pass a tow, and the 2 destroyers could only stand off and wait to take men aboard. At 4:30 p.m., with the light going and the ship lower in the water every hour, Hutchins gave the order he'd spent the day trying not to give. Abandon ship. The fight had not taken a single man, but leaving Borie was a dangerous proposition. The men went over the side into 44-degree water and 20-foot seas. Through the whole night, the gunfire and the ramming and the hours pinned together, not one man aboard had died. The dying started now, in the abandonment, with the rafts coming alongside Goff and Barry in the swell. The rescue ships rolled and pitched, and men who had fought all night and bailed all day reached the hulls and could not climb them. A total of 27 men were lost to the ocean. Some were knocked away. Some went under at the rail. Hutchins put it simply afterward, quote, "Many of the lost were just unable to get over the side." Borie would not go down even then. Emptied of her crew, she rode out the night alone and was still afloat the next morning. Goff and Barry fired torpedoes into her, and the torpedoes went wide in the swell. A 4-inch shell from Barry hit her bridge, and she stayed up. It took a plane off guard and a 500-pound bomb to finally put her under. A ship launched in 1919 had run down and finished a modern submarine. The boat she beat was newer, her hull built thicker and heavier to take the deep dives Borie was never meant to make, and that heavier hull was the one that survived the night. Borie's plating, worn thin by 23 years, had opened against it and let the sea in. She'd won the fight, and the winning had finished her. Her crew came home with 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Silver Stars, and a Legion of Merit. The strategy that had handed them the win, a carrier and a few old destroyers sent out to hunt instead of guard, was the same one that had left an old destroyer alone in the middle of 5 wolf packs with her hull coming apart. When the Navy studied what had happened, the lesson it drew was about her age. It went back to the other flush-deck destroyers still in service from the last war and reinforced their bows with beams and concrete, so the next old ship to do what Borie did might come home.